Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all and to be with you today. This is the first Sunday in our season of Lent, which is fantastic and also very somber. Hopefully not too somber for you. Lent is this season of preparation that we sort of utilize as a tool to get ready for our celebration of Easter and Christ's resurrection. And we kicked it off really last Wednesday, Valentine's Day as it's known to the rest of the world, but for us it was just Ash Wednesday. And we actually have this great thing that only happens about 4 times a century, where we get to conclude this with Easter, which happens on April Fool's Day this year, which is great because it is the greatest cosmic April Fool's joke ever. But our path to get there is going to be, a little bit winding, hopefully spiritually a little bit winding for you, and you'll stop and take your time a little bit. In the Jordan services, what we're going to do over the next few weeks is make sure that every single Sunday we hear a little bit more about the covenants that God has made with God's people. We've got a class going on before the service about covenants as well. That's going to be our major focus. The covenant that God made with Noah today, the covenant that God made with Abraham and his ancestors forever. The everlasting covenant that God makes with Moses, but especially the new covenant that God makes with us through Jesus Christ. That will be our primary focus as we push through that story of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. But before we even get there, covenant is really just one of those church words, isn't it, that we throw around all the time. Maybe all the time for you, I don't know. We throw it around a lot in the church. We rarely define it well. I just had someone in the class before talk about how that word it sounds like this static contract that we developed with one another once upon a time, or developed with God once upon a time, and not a living relationship. And living relationship is what covenants are actually about. The word covenant comes to us from Latin, and it really means the coming together. The coming together of two parties in relationship with one another, right? A covenant, like, say, a set of marriage vows, a set of agreements that two parties make as they come together. But it's the relationship that defines how that covenant will play out day in and day out, moment by moment. That's how covenants work. So today we have this covenant with Noah. But in order to understand how they even got there, you really have to back up a little bit, right? What preceded this that made this the establishing of a new relationship? This is early on in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible. So we're not that far in. And yet, as it happens to happen from time to time, humans have made an utter disaster out of everything, right? Humans have only been created for 6 chapters by the time we read what we read today. And we've mucked it up pretty badly. So here's how it starts off, right? We've got Adam and Eve, the first humans created. And they were given a set of responsibilities, and that didn't turn out so well. They had one rule. They didn't follow it. They get kicked out of the garden. And then as Genesis tells itself, what happens is they begin to be fruitful and multiply. And as they multiply, the children of Adam and Eve begin to collect into these societies, into these cities. But because somehow their idea of what is moral has been corrupt ever since Adam and Eve chose morality for themselves instead of God's version of morality, those societies became corrupt. Those civilizations became harmful to the world. As it goes on and we get into the story of Noah, we have a couple of references that God makes to exactly what's happened. One of them is this, right at the beginning of chapter 6, the Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, the whole earth. When it says the earth, it means everywhere. That every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And how many different ways can it underline all of it? All of it, all together, only evil ever continually, period, the end. They're the worst. Then it goes on a little bit further. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. A dismal, bleak scene, and God is disappointed. So God comes up with a plan. As if God had created the earth with some sort of cosmic etch-a-sketch. God's going to pick the whole thing up and just shake it a couple good times and reset and redesign, hopefully without that flaw, that thing that caused us to be only about violence ever and continually. God's going to bring a flood to cleanse the earth of all of human corruption and let the earth flourish again without us. And then something surprising happens. And it ought to be that this is the thing that is surprising. Not that God was disappointed in us. We give God lots of reasons to be disappointed in us. Not that we were disappointing. That should be well understood about our nature as well. But that instead of shaking the Etch-a-Sketch, God looks down and finds this guy named Noah and just decides to love him. And God's commitment to humanity is so strong that when God wants more than anything to just start over, God sees someone and says, you know what? We'll try something else. So God sets up a relationship with Noah, a relationship with everyone through Noah, mostly because everyone else is going to be dead. Noah's going to be the only one left, right? A relationship with all of humanity. So this is a great story, right? Already we're in a good story. It makes you kind of wonder why this is the story that we choose to teach our kids right off the bat in Sunday school. Like, my kids have one of those Melissa and Doug. This is one of those companies that makes kids' toys. Got one of those Noah's Ark sets. It just sits in our dining room right now. This constant reminder of humanity's disappointment and God's utter desire to wipe us off the face of the planet. And truly, it is a reminder of God's commitment to us, God's loyalty to humanity. And so God saves Noah and his family, and you know the story, saves the animals 2 by 2, and reestablishes a new creation, a new set of relationships. That's actually the charge that is given to Noah and his family. You will be the ones with whom I reestablish a relationship. It's the pattern of these covenants. The relationship is broken because of sin. And when God solves for that sin, when God fixes it, God comes back and reestablishes those relationships. But notice that it's about somehow partnership. That God doesn't say, okay, I've fixed everything, off you go. But instead, some things aren't fixed. But Noah, you and your family need to get about the business of living the way that you ought to live. So God says, Noah, you and your family, be fruitful and multiply, which I jot down as the greatest, most fun single commandment that God ever put in any of the commandments. And then secondly, it's not really a commandment. God just sort of changes the menu. You are allowed to eat meat now, which was not the case prior to that. That's a little Genesis trivia for you. And then stepping to what actually becomes the sort of command that we're used to, where God says, do not do this. It doesn't say do not do this, but instead God says that human life is so sacred, that life is so sacred, not just human life. All life is so sacred. That's what that be fruitful and multiply thing is all about, by the way. Life is so sacred that the shedding of blood, that violence will be such a sacrilege that there has to be a reckoning for it. That's part of the bargain. God's not going to wipe us all out. And God knows that we will still be infected by whatever it is that causes human violence to begin. We'll still be infected by that sin. It causes us to have our hearts turn to wickedness and violence continually. God knows it, and God isn't going to destroy us for it, but instead establishes a set of relationships through Noah and says, life is sacred, so protect it. Life is sacred, so protect it. Create it and protect it, and we'll be fine. It's not hard, like I said, to find this story right now. It's not hard to find this sort of story in the midst of a world that we live in today, where we are still encountered with humanity's turning toward violence only and ever and continually. It's not hard to see why God would be disappointed with humanity's choices. Sometimes it's hard to see that we are a humanity that lives as if we are still in this covenant relationship with God, as if we are still held in a relationship with God that says, okay, God, we know that you are going to remain loyal to us. And out of our thanksgiving for that, let us protect the sanctity of human life as if our very existence depends on it. It's not what I saw when I heard most of the discussions that I've heard this week after yet another school shooting. I saw all sorts of things that had nothing to do with that. I don't think we can be a people that come together and say thank you to God for God's loyalty to us without upholding the other side of it, which is our commitment back to God and to one another to protect life. And I know that's a complicated set of issues, and God promises us that we're not going to solve it, actually. I hope you heard that in this everlasting covenant that God makes with us. God's not going to destroy us for it, but our sin is what it is. God doesn't expect us to solve it. God's going to solve it with another covenant. But instead, God expects us to participate. We are partners with God. And what that means is that we have to do something. And we can even be wrong about what we do. But we have to do something. There are no cheap or easy answers about what that is. It's been something that's been with us for our entire history, the entirety of human history. But the answer is that if we are going to be people who thank God for God's loyalty to us, we also have to be a people who love God enough to do something with our lives in partnership with God to make this world a better place, to heal the brokenness of human relationship, to be about love and life in such a way in this world that there's no question that we have been sent forward by the very God of life and love that created us and constantly comes to us with new possibility for relationship. In this season of Lent, as we hear over and over again these stories of our failures, but of God's loyalty to us, every single week as we hear another one of those stories, every single week as we see in our world that story writ large, every week as we see ourselves in these stories, I pray that you won't just come together to say thank you to God for who God is, but that you'll let it change who you are. If you and I are changed into people who value love and life more than anything, we might just make a difference in this world. For the sake of the God who sent us into this world to make a difference. If you and I can be so profoundly changed by God's reflection of love and life back to us, you and I might just do what Noah and his family were supposed to do in the beginning. To shed life and love so far abroad and so deeply that we truly look like a people who are partnering with God to heal what is broken in this world. If you're going to call yourself God's people, be about that work. Amen.